Thank you for joining our webcast today on China drug registration and reimbursement. We appreciate your attendance. My name is Ames Gross, and I'm the president and founder of Pacific Bridge Medical. I started Pacific Bridge Medical in 1988, about 35 years ago. The main theme on our webcast today is it's easier to register drugs in China, but reimbursements have been lowered significantly over the last few years. Next. As I mentioned, I founded Pacific Bridge Medical in 1988, which is now 35 years ago. We've helped many companies, both with regulatory, product registration, and business development exclusively in Asia, and we are knowledgeable about the Asian healthcare markets. And we also have a great team of executives on the ground in Asia with various medical expertise. Next. We have 4 offices in Asia, in Japan, China, Singapore, and Hong Kong, and we have affiliate partners in all the other Asian locations. Next. To give you a sense of the Asian pharmaceutical markets, we put together this chart here. Obviously, the United States has the largest drug market in the world, followed by the EU, and then China and Asia Pacific. If you add China and Asia Pacific together now, you can see it's about the same size as the European Union, as far as the size of the drug markets go. On the right side, we broke down the Asian markets, Asian pharmaceutical markets by country, and you can see second to China in Asia would be Japan, and then the other Asian markets would be India would be next, and then Korea would be the 4th largest or 5th largest in Asia today. Next. So we're going to talk first about China drug registration. So obviously the first thing you want to do when you're looking at the Chinese market is to research the disease prevalence in China. Some diseases that are prevalent in the West may or may not be so prevalent in China. This is an important thing to investigate when you're starting. What is the clinical demand or the epidemiological status, the severity of the disease and prognosis of the indication of the intended drug that must be analyzed in China? Does the new drug offer advantages over existing drugs? What is the demand from the Chinese patients? So you want to look at the CDE website for competing products, and to understand where competitors may be, you can look at the website on the bottom of the slide here on slide 5 to understand what competitors and where the competitors may be in the clinical trial process. Next. The primary drug agency in China is the NMPA. It's under the State Administration of Market Regulation, and the CDE is the Center for Drug Evaluation, which approves clinical trials in drugs. With regard to drugs, the major law is the Drug Administrative Law, or the DAL, which covers drug development, registration, manufacturing, and the marketing of drugs in China. Also, the drug registration requirements, or the DRR, covers classifications, clinical trials, small molecule drugs, biologics, etc. Most importantly, keep in mind that there are counterparts of the national NMPA at the provincial, county, and municipal levels. So the provincial NMPAs can be very important with regard, especially with regard to reimbursement. Next. This just graphically shows you in this chart the information that we just mentioned, with the legislation being the DAL. Also, the legislation, there's separate legislation for vaccine administrative law. Then you have the drug registration regulation, effective July 1st, 2020. the China Pharmacopoeia registered specifications as of 2020, and actually the hard copy of the China Pharmacopoeia has recently come out and is available for purchase. And then you have technical guidelines, also part of the China regulatory framework. Next slide. So how do you register your products? The main thing is in other countries would be the classification of your drug in China. For small molecule drugs, there are 5 categories. Categories 1 through 5. Category 1, innovative drugs that have not been marketed inside or outside of China. Category 2, drugs with improvements to such things as dosage forms, formulation process, route of administration, and indication that have been marketed inside or outside of China. Category 2 contains a number of different subcategories for different types of improvements, which further refine the registration requirements. And you can see categories 3 and categories 4 are for generics, and category 5, which is often the case for foreign drugs, drugs that are marketed abroad but not in China yet. Category 5.1 is for the originator overseas drugs and drugs with improvements, and 5.2 is for generics. The second major area of classification would be traditional Chinese medicines. I don't believe anybody in the call is trying to export or register their traditional Chinese medicine on the phone, so we'll go to the next slide. With respect to biologics, there are 3 main categories. Category 1, innovative biologic products that are not marketed inside or outside of China yet. Category 2, improved biological products with improvements related to safety, efficacy, or quality, and clear clinical advantages that are based on biologics, marketed inside or outside of China. Category 3, which has 4 subcategories, which is appropriate for biologic products marketed domestically or overseas. So you can see the subcategories for category 3 below. Next slide. All the classifications, whether it's small molecules or biologic products, can be broken down further. And you can see here for chemical drugs, additional subcategories as of innovative drugs, improved new drugs, or generics. And for biologics, innovative biologic products, new improved biological products, and biological products marketed, including biosimilars. So the registration requirements, the documents, and the processes are determined by the drug classification of your product in China. Next. Market authorization holders, or MAHs. So the MAH can submit the paperwork for clinical trials, your marketing authorization, supplementary applications, etc. in China. The MAH of a drug manufactured overseas has to be the overseas legal entity. Either a subsidiary of the foreign drug manufacturer, the Chinese distributor partner, or another third-party local regulatory service provider is eligible to perform MAH obligations as the local agent of the foreign drug manufacturer and can be considered the local MAH. You can see below on Article 38 of the Drug Administrative Law, the DAL law, if the marketing authorization holder of a drug is an overseas entity, the designated legal entity in China shall fulfill the obligations of the drug marketing authorization holder and bear joint liabilities with the drug market authorization holder. Next slide. So recently we had a situation where we had a biotech company as a client and they were having a problem. The US biotech company had developed and manufactured a drug and had out-licensed the drug in the US and Europe to third-party drug companies. So in the US biotech company was no longer the MAH, because they had licensed out the rights for their drug to a third-party US drug company. But now the client wants to license in China to a Chinese drug company. But the Chinese drug company is concerned that the US client is no longer the MAH in the US, even though the drug is being made in the US through the biotech company. Because in the US, as I mentioned, the drug had been licensed out to a third party. So after full legal and RA investigation, the Chinese drug company cannot license the drug from the biotech company because other companies in the US and EU are MAHs. And those other companies do not want to be the MAH for the drug in China because they don't have rights for China and they're not selling the product in China. So what happens in this case study is the US biotech company needs to buy back the MAH rights from the company in the US they licensed the drug to. So the biotech company can now be the MAH in the US and subsequently be the MAH in China. And after they did that, then they were able to license their drug out to the Chinese drug company. Next slide. So this goes into a couple different scenarios for MAH registration for a foreign drug. In scenario one, the foreign company X's drug as an overseas approved drug is registered as an import drug in China. Company X is the MAH, while its subsidiary in China is the local MAH. So the foreign drug company has set up a subsidiary in China to be its own local MAH. The advantage of this is that the obligations of the local MAH can be fulfilled by the foreign drug company subsidiary in China, and all intellectual property is held internally through the company's subsidiary operation. The disadvantage of this is setting up a Chinese company requires time and effort, such as recruitment of key personnel, various expenses to set up the office, etc. So if you have to set up a subsidiary to be your own MAH in China, it could be an expensive venture. Scenario two is where the foreign drug company's drug is approved overseas and is being registered as an import drug in China. So the foreign company, again, is the MAH in China, while a third-party service provider, like our office in China, is a local agent or local MAH. The advantage of this scenario is it costs less than setting up subsidiary in China for a single product, but if the foreign company has a portfolio of products, it would be more cost-effective to set up your own subsidiary there. Next slide. So this is we're outlining here different regulatory strategies for a drug that's being developed, let's say in the US or Europe. So basically, over the last few years, drug companies have utilized three main pathways for drug registration in China. Scenario one, which is becoming more common because it can reduce the number of Chinese in the clinical study and can reduce the overall cost of the drug registration in China, is China simultaneously joining the global clinical development via multi-regional clinical trial. So the trial may occur in US, Europe, and China simultaneously. The benefit of this pathway is to strategically leverage the global overall trials and use the minimum sample size in the Chinese population to satisfy the requirements of the NDA approval in China. So more and more companies now are looking at this as the best pathway and the first priority to assess all the elements of the clinical trial costs, site feasibility, recruitment rate, etc. The calculation of the number of Chinese patients in a simultaneous multi-regional clinical trial is outlined in the ICH E17. But in general terms, we say that normally 15 to 20% of the patients should be in China for this type of global simultaneous study. Next slide. If the foreign drug company has already registered their products in the US or Europe, and now they want to enter the Asian markets and the China market specifically, they may want to do a multi-regional clinical trial in Asia. So you can see here, another option is to do another regional MRCT in which at least 2 to 3 Asian countries are selected from a group of Asian countries. Now, since this is an additional phase 3 study separate from the US and EU study, the sample size of the Chinese population is bigger than the scenario 1, the global MRCT, and this will normally result in more costs and more time than in the scenario 1 in the previous slide. So generally, in an Asian MRCT, we recommend about 60% of the patients come from China or Chinese places where they have Chinese population like Taiwan and Hong Kong, and sometimes Chinese from other Asian markets can be added. So we know that in Singapore, Malaysia, and some other Asian countries, there's large Chinese populations, but overall, we want to see about 60% of the Asian MRCT coming from patients that have Chinese ethnic origin. Next slide. Finally, the third regulatory pathway for clinical trials is broken down into 2 scenarios. Scenario 3 has 2 options, 3A and 3B. Now, option 3A is the traditional pathway that has been taken by MNCs over the last 30 years. Under this scenario 3A, China is considered a second wave country for global pipeline development. So the company has already done clinical trials and maybe even gotten approval in the US or Europe, and now is thinking about going to China. So the drug applicant could apply for the local CTA to run an additional local clinical trial in China. They may bridge the global phase 3 data. So the study design can be discussed with the Chinese CDA in a pre-IND meeting with respect to the treatment, sample size, ethnic differences, etc. So the NDA application will be submitted with the global CTA package and also the Chinese trial data after completion of the local trial. Of course, this is the most expensive and longest path. Since we haven't had any Chinese ethnic people in the US or European studies, we need to get a full load of Chinese patients in China to now get the approval in China. So unlike scenarios 1 and 2, we'll need more Chinese patients for the follow-up China clinical study. And because of that, the costs will be higher. Scenario 3B is on the 4th bullet point there. And this is a situation where the applicant initiates the NDA in China, directly in China, with just using the full package of clinical data after the first global approval of a new indication in the US or EU with CPP availability. So in this scenario 3B, no clinical data is done in China. In general, the applicant needs to provide all the global CTD packages from the reference country, including a full CSR of the pivotal phase 3, other clinical data, etc. But this option 3B, without a local Chinese clinical study, the chance of success in China these days for strategy or scenario 3B is not very high. Next slide. This slide basically graphically illustrates what we just went over on the 3 options for registration in China, especially as you can see, numbers 1, 2, and 3 on the slide. So the first scenario is on the first line there where it says GSS MRCT global trial. So again, in this case, the global clinical trial is initiated in US, Europe, and then also China simultaneously. You have the Chinese phase 3 data, and then you can apply for the NDA. That's the quickest and cheapest scenario. Scenario 2 is the Asian MRCT, where you may have approval already, or you've started clinical trials already in the US or Europe, and now you want to begin, subsequent to those trials, an Asian clinical study. And you can see here, the time would be a little longer than scenario 1. And of course, you'll need more Chinese patients than you did in scenario 1 for scenario 2. And again, the traditional development pathway, or 3A, which I just mentioned on the previous slide, is we've already gotten approval in the US and Europe. And so now we're starting the process in China. And of course, we'll have the most Chinese patients needed, and it'll take a longer time, and the costs will be the highest. So, as I mentioned, more and more drug companies are looking to do global, multi-regional clinical trials to expedite the process and reduce the fees or expenses. Next slide. Of course, in China, to get the clinical study started, you need to get the approval of the ethics committee. The ethics committee will study your protocol, clinical trial application, informed consent, etc. The main question for the ethics committee is, are the Chinese patients protected during the study? Please keep in mind, for post-approval studies, you do not need to submit a CTA and get CDE approval. You just need to get ethics committee approval to begin post-market studies. Next slide. Now, over the last few years, there have been a number of changes with clinical trials in China, which have led to expediting the clinical trial process and expediting the registration in China. So these are a number of bullet points of recent clinical trial updates for China. So now for different registration applications, it's clear what the clinical trial requirements are than it used to be. This is over the last couple of years. It only takes 60 days to get a CTA approval. You may recall 5 years ago, to get a CTA approval may have taken 1 to 1.5 years. So now it's reduced to 60 days. The minimum case requirements are no longer required, but general guidelines exist for each trial. And imported drugs no longer have to be approved abroad or finish phase 2 studies abroad before China clinical studies start. And as we just discussed, multi-regional global clinical trials. Phase 1 studies can also be done simultaneously in other countries and China. That was not the case a few years ago. You do not need the drug to be approved in the country of origin before your submission in China. Obviously, if you're doing a global clinical study, your drug wouldn't be approved in the US or Europe. And clinical data outside of China can be used in China's submissions, partially or fully, if the data is accurate, meets ICH and GCP requirements. If overseas data does not include safety and efficacy on Chinese patients, or does not consider ethnic differences, a PK bridging study will most likely be needed. The other alternative is to try to include Chinese patients in your Western clinical trials in the US or Europe. Next slide. This goes through the clinical trial acceptance process. You can see on the left, the CTA is submitted, it's reviewed. The CDE in China will make an evaluation of the CTA. And then if 60 days have passed since the acceptance of the CTA and there's no objections, the clinical trial can start. On the two boxes below that, a letter of request for information will be issued if there's some minor or major issues. And then it talks about how much time you have to respond. And then if there's no reply from the CDE after 60 days, you can assume the clinical trial has been approved. Again, clinical trials need to be registered at the website below, and all investigational drugs must be manufactured at GMP facilities and meet GMP standards. Next slide. With regard to GCP guidelines are similar to other countries in a number of ways. Registration clinical trials must follow the 2020 clinical practice regulations that were revised in 2020, as well as ICH and CDE requirements. Trials can only be done at hospitals that have been accredited by the NMPA. The ethics committee or the NMPA can cancel studies if there's a safety problem or other issues. It used to be difficult to change the protocol, but now the drug registration requirements allow some changes in the protocol during the trial. Some clinical trial guidelines on specific drugs were released in 2020, and now China is permitting or accepting more real-world evidence. And real-world evidence can come from places like doing the trial in southern China, which we'll talk about later, or maybe even on Hainan Island, which we'll also talk about later. Next slide. So this slide basically just shows you the CMC requirements for CTA between the US, EU, and China. I think the slide is fairly self-explanatory. So let's go to the next slide, please. Now, will the Chinese CDE accept overseas clinical trial data? So the key points for accepting the foreign clinical trial data is ensure the authenticity, completeness of overseas clinical trial data, and the accuracy and the traceability of the data, so the NMPA will feel comfortable. The submitted data should include biopharmaceuticals, clinical pharmacology, efficacy, and safety data, and it is recommended to submit in the CTD format. So the acceptance of foreign clinical trials, clinical data is divided into three categories: full acceptance, partial acceptance, and non-acceptance. And you can get more information on these three different levels of acceptance of foreign clinical data in the bullet points below. Next slide, please. This is just some more information about the acceptability of foreign clinical data. So you can see on the first bullet point, depending on the overseas clinical data is carried out based on the characteristic of the drug itself and the relevant technical guidelines. So the factors to be considered include those related to genetic and physiological and cultural and environmental characteristics. For example, overseas China data and overseas clinical trials, when the drugs are mainly metabolized by genetic polymorphic enzymes and drug metabolism has a critical impact on the efficacy or safety, it can be used as the main factor for ethnic difference analysis. However, drugs whose metabolic process is greatly affected by diet, or those whose diseases are treated by environmental factors like culture, medical practice, cannot be used as the main factors in the analysis of ethnic differences. So again, how does the drug help Chinese patients? What is the possible impact of a PK or PD study between Chinese and foreign patients? Next slide. So keep in mind, over the last few years, the CDE has bolstered their department. I think it went from like 100 reviewers like 6 years ago to 1,000 reviewers today. And in 2021, they accepted over 11,000 drug applications including 2,000 innovative drugs, which was up 75% over 2020. So the CDE has a lot more capability to register drugs, to review and register drugs today than they did 3 or 4 years ago. So once the preclinical studies and clinical studies are completed, the drug marketing authorization holder, or MAH, should submit and the dossier should be reviewed. Keep in mind that you'll need to get drug samples from 3 batches, must be tested by the NIFDC, or the National Institute for Food and Drug Control. The CDE organizes technical reviewers to review the accepted drug marketing authorization applications. And then after the review, if the application materials fulfill the requirements, an acceptance in China will be issued. And below, you can just see these different steps as we just discussed. Next slide. I think everybody on the call is familiar with CTD documents and modules. Obviously, the Chinese application needs to follow ICH guidelines, including the application, CTD, clinical trial data, etc. So here we've outlined some of the requirements for the different modules, but again, I think they're fairly self-explanatory, and we'll go on to the next slide now. Now, in addition to the information just mentioned, for chemical drugs, the JX specification includes controls for the drug product. For biologics, the JS specification contains controls of the drug substance and drug product. The Chinese agency may add both release and shelf life testing items and CHP items too. For chemical drugs, the manufacturing information sheet, or the MPIS, is for the NDA, not for the CTA. For biologics, the manufacturing and testing procedures, or the MTP documents, are for both the CTA and the NDA. And keep in mind, it's always good to do a gap analysis before doing any drug registration in China. Next. Now, this is the review time for the CDE in China. The normal review time is 200 business days. If you can get a priority review, it's only 130 days. And if it's for an urgently needed or rare disease, it's possible to have the CDE review your dossier within 70 business days. And keep in mind, though, if there are any deficiencies, applicants must report to the report back to the CDE within 80 working days. Next. So what we have on the next few slides is information on the expedited review pathways. So priority review process of the NDA or BLA. Applications of the priority NDA or BLA process are for innovative or modified new drugs and clinical shortage and greatly unmet medical needs. We're talking about the priority review now. There are 4 expedited review processes. The priority review application can be submitted together with the NDA BLA submission with the precondition that the CDE agrees in the pre-NDA BLA meeting. As I mentioned, the estimated time frame for priority review is 130 days, not the standard 200 working days. And for rare disease drugs or urgently needed drugs, again, 70 working days in China. And keep in mind that the NMPA has the right to terminate the priority review status when the priority drugs no longer meet the priority criteria. So these are some of the key facts for expedited review in China. And one pathway is the priority review process. Next slide. The second expedited review is the breakthrough therapeutic drug process, or the BTD. The BTD can be awarded or granted to any new drugs with evidence of significant clinical values demonstrated in clinical trials, used for the prevention and treatment of severely life-threatening diseases and impacting quality of life issues, etc. The breakthrough application can be submitted by the applicant. The breakthrough applicant may be awarded with priority communication and consultation by the CDE during the clinical trials, and also the NMPA has the right to withdraw the BTD designation when the application no longer meets the breakthrough therapeutic drug criteria. Next slide. The third expedited review is the conditional NDA or BLA approval process. A conditional NDA or BLA approval can be achieved for drugs with sufficient clinical efficacy data to predict the clinical value in the treatment of severely life-threatening and greatly unmet medical needs or great improvements on quality and efficacy. These are drugs with sufficient clinical efficacy data to predict the clinical values and the needs of the public, like a health emergency, or vaccines with urgent needs. The applicant who receives conditional approval needs to complete the required post-marketing commitment within a defined timeframe, and it is responsible for taking the risk management measures for the marketed drugs during the conditional approval period. Again, the NMPA has the right to withdraw a conditional approved drug, and similar to the situation in the other two scenarios for expedited review. The fourth expedited review way is the special approval on the bottom of the page. For public health emergencies, special reviews by the NMPA are possible. The NMPA may accept approvals, inspections, and sample testing for special approval in the expedited review. Next slide, please. So this slide basically shows you when you can apply for these expedited review processes in China. So you can see the expedited review, the four scenarios I mentioned: the breakthrough therapy, the conditional approval, the priority review, and the special review. So this shows you when you can apply for these expedited reviews, either during the IND stage or the NDA stage. Next slide. So this is laying out the time for a drug approval, and this includes the time for the CDE to review the documents, etc. So the standard drug review period, I put down here 3 to 4 months for preparation of the drug submission dossier and preparation of the technical information for the API excipients or drug packaging materials with the cooperation of those suppliers. It may take 3 months for organizing the meeting with the CDE, 10 months for the evaluation by the CDE, or 200 working days, 8 months for addressing, you have 8 months for addressing any deficiencies that the CDE brings up. And then it's about another month and a half for NMPA approval and license and getting your license. So the total approval time for a drug in China is now somewhere between 17 and 26 months after the clinical trials are completed. This was almost double before the new regulations came into effect in China. So that's why it's easier to register drugs in China and faster. Now, the scenario below is for the priority drug review. So the same timeframes for the priority drug review are for the standard drug review, except for instead of 10 months for the evaluation, the CDE will take 6.5 months or about 130 working days. In addition, for addressing deficiencies, you only have 6 months and not the 8 months from the standard drug review. So for the priority review, you can normally knock off about 5 months. And you can see on the bottom somewhere between 14 and 21 months after the clinical trials are completed. Next. Now, obviously, one of the most important things is having good CDE meetings in China. So the CDE meetings are available to discuss key issues. All materials submitted must be in Chinese for CDE meetings and sent in when requesting the meeting. And of course, the CDA must agree in advance to having the meeting. There are generally 3 types of CDE meetings, type 1, 2, and 3. And you can see type 1 deals with safety issues during the clinical trials. Type 2 is generally for a pre-IND meeting. And type 3 is basically a meeting that covers issues that are not covered in types 1 or 2. Now, during the pandemic, more of the meetings were done by teleconferences. Meetings are now being done more face-to-face in China with the CDE. Next slide. Of course, after the approval, you may have to submit some post-approval changes, and major changes need new approvals, a new indication, a new route of administration, etc. Moderate changes require notification, changes to drug packaging labels, for example. Minor changes can be outlined in the annual report, if it's a small manufacturing change. Normally, you need 60 working days for single changes to be accepted, and 80 working days if there are multiple changes submitted, or 200 working days if an inspection or risk-based testing is needed, if you have a new indication or new route of administration. Keep in mind, Chinese drug renewals are required every 5 years. Next. Now, Chinese patent law, obviously, everybody on the line is familiar with the potential for intellectual property infringement or copying in China. And so recently they came out with the new Chinese patent law. So the law was issued by the China National Intellectual Property Administration, or the CNIPA. Grants drug patents and plays an important role in the patent linkage system. So basically, with the patent linkage system, if a patent dispute arises, there's now a dispute resolution mechanism that can be put in place. So the patent holder can issue a lawsuit against a generic company to claim that the generic infringes on the foreign innovative product patent. The CDE now will analyze and review all the materials, wait for about 9 months before approving the generic drug for chemical drugs, but for biologics, it's not clear that there's going to be a 9-month wait before they approve, let's say, a biosimilar. Generally, the maximum patent protection is 14 years in China. Despite this, it appears in some cases that generic drug developers are still able to file ANDAs as soon as innovative drugs are released. Keep in mind, in China, the patent law is still evolving. And although the Chinese patent law is new as of 2020, there are still some issues that are being dealt with in this area. Next. Of course, now in China, most people are familiar with the HGR regulations, or the Human Genetic Resources Regulations. This is basically where China doesn't want foreign companies to take genetic resources in their clinical trials or whatever outside of China. So as you can see on the first bullet point, China considers HGR as part of their national security. Most, or the Ministry of Science and Technology, establishes and enforces HGR regulations. Drug companies need pre-approval or record filing with the Human Genetic Resource Administration of China prior to starting research projects, or clinical trials based on China's genetic resources. And under the cybersecurity law, HGR is regulated as personal data. So HGR are materials are genetic materials which include tissues and cells containing human genomes, organs, or genes. HGR information includes data generated from HGR materials. Foreign drug companies collecting genetic samples must fill out an HDR application and submit it to most. And unlike other Asian countries, tissue samples or other types of samples cannot be easily exported out of China, and data transfer requires approvals too. If you're able to get most approval, the transmission of HDR information is still okay. If you do not comply with the HDR regulations, most can administer large fees to foreign drug companies dealing with HDR materials in China. So HDR regulations came into effect a couple of years ago, and of course, this is a key issue for your clinical trials and registration in China. Next. Now, there are two quicker strategies to access China. The first one might be from Hainan Island. Hainan Island is an island off of the southeast coast of China. And on Hainan Island is basically a tourist place where Chinese or foreign tourists can come to get special medical treatment. So the island gives patients early access to unapproved drugs and medical devices in China, but of course they must be approved drugs or medical devices approved in the US or Europe first. But on the island, patients can get access to unapproved drugs and devices. So basically, hospitals in Hainan Island can apply for the unapproved products in China and get approvals relatively quickly only for Hainan Island. Once the drug application is approved, it can be used by medical institutions in the pilot area of Hainan Island. The real-world data for highly needed drugs and medical devices can be used for product registration from Hainan Island if they follow Chinese requirements. The second quicker access strategy to China would be through the Greater Bay Area. The Greater Bay Area is several provinces in southern China, where there are 9 cities, or maybe about 90 million people, where if you have registration already for your drug in Hong Kong or Macau, you can then register your drug in the southern Greater Bay Area in China. Next. So now we're going to go over some information for DMFs, excipients, and drug packaging material. Keep in mind that if you're using outside suppliers for excipients, API, or drug packaging materials, that information needs to be submitted with your drug filed by your MAH for product approval. However, oftentimes, the suppliers of API, excipients, and drug packaging materials are outside of your company, and they don't want to share that information with you in your drug file. So API, excipient, and drug packaging material suppliers can register their own drug master files in China today. So you can see on the second bullet point, if you're using outside suppliers, these suppliers will need to provide proprietary information to the drug manufacturer or the MAH. So these suppliers may not find it acceptable to provide this information to the drug manufacturer or the MAH. So again, the API, excipient, or drug packaging material companies can submit their own DMFs where their information will be kept confidential. And once the drug is approved, the DMF files would become active. Then if other drug manufacturers want to use the same API, excipients, or drug packaging materials, they can reference the DMF numbers of these suppliers. Next slide. So this slide just gives you some of the requirements for DMF registration for APIs in China. Next slide. So keep in mind that after you submit the initial required dossier to get an API DMF in China, you get a DMF number. It usually takes about 1 to 2 months for the DMF number of an API to be released. This may take longer depending on the CDE's workload. However, keep in mind that the initial number issued by the CDE for your DMF is considered inactive. So it's considered inactive until the fees, documents, and samples are tested in China and the information goes through an administrative review to be approved and listed as active. So basically, the situation with APIs is that they're very similar to drug registration now on the DMF. Well, in the past, there hadn't been any government fees for DMFs for APIs in China. That changed in 2020. And now the NMPA is charging about $50,000 US to get an DMF for an API in China. Next slide. With regard to excipients and packaging materials, this gives you some information which is required for your submission for a DMF for excipients and or for a DMF for packaging materials. Next. Again, once the dossier is submitted for DMF for excipients or packaging or drug packaging materials, it usually takes about 1 to 2 months for the DMF number to be issued. Again, the number that's issued is the DMF is considered inactive. And once the registration of the drug product that uses the excipient or drug packaging material is approved, the DMF becomes active. And there's still no government fees for DMFs for excipients or drug packaging materials, but we understand this is now being considered by the CDE in China. Next slide. I'm going to talk briefly about orphan drugs and rare diseases in China. The first rare disease list was issued in China in 2018. So you can see the list was jointly issued by the National Health Commission, the Ministry of Science and Technology, the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, and the China Food and Drug Administration and the State Administration of Traditional Chinese Medicines. But keep in mind, not all rare diseases in the West are also considered rare diseases in China. So there's some specific inclusion criteria below. So the disease will cause great harm to Chinese patients and their families. There is definite a method of diagnosis of the rare disease. There is a financially affordable treatment or intervention to help the patient. So the financially affordable treatment is really a key issue because, as you know, many orphan drugs for rare diseases in the West are very, very expensive. And the Chinese government has been cutting down on orphan drug reimbursement over the last few years. Next slide. Keep in mind that there's not a separate dossier requirement for orphan drugs in China. It is the same dossier and same requirements as chemical drugs. The CD requires dossier in CTD format, modules 1 to 5, oversees clinical data, and ethnic data sensitivities. On your application, you need to outline the basic conditions of the disease, including the disease in English and Chinese, the incidence or prevalence, sex, age of onset, diagnostic criteria, etc. So then the question becomes, what is the annual cost of the orphan drug treatment in China, and is there any insurance? So again, you have to also include information on the data sources and references for the above materials. Please keep in mind that it is like a drug application, it's a very detailed application, and you need to have good clinical support. Next. So this is a time chart and some fees for a orphan drug registration or a priority review. Again, priority review is 130 days, not the standard review time of 200 days. And you can see on the slide on the blue arrow, it gives you the approximate time for each stage, including the requesting a meeting with the CDE, meeting with the CDA, the priority review designation period, NDA submission, and then the NDA approval. It also, on the far left, gives you some ideas about a service fee to put together the orphan drug designation, as well as some of the information on the government NDA registration fee. Keep in mind, too, that if a PK study is required, it may take about an additional 10 months or an additional cost of over 1.25 million RMB, or Chinese currency, RMB or yuan. Next slide. So as I mentioned, the orphan drug pricing has been reduced significantly in China over the last few years. So it's easier to get orphan drugs registered in China if the disease is on the rare disease list. You can see in 2021, 58 drugs for over 28 rare diseases were included. We worked on some different orphan drug registrations and reimbursements. We'd say in general that if the annual cost for the rare disease is around $31,000 or $32,000, we believe there's a market potential for the orphan drug. But if the cost is significantly higher, which is what we see in many orphan drugs in the West, many Chinese families, they just can't afford it. You can see on the example below, when the drug nosinagen sodium injection is a treatment for the rare disease of spinal muscular atrophy, was approved to enter the Chinese market. The price was about $110,000 per injection. It was later reduced to $87,000, and then in December 2021, the reimbursement for this orphan drug was down to $5,000. So more drugs, orphan drugs being approved in China, reimbursements still difficult for orphan drugs in China. Next. So now we finished our section on drug registration for today, and we're going to talk about drug reimbursement. As I mentioned when I started the presentation today, drug registration is a lot easier in China. There's more reviewers. The time frame to get a clinical study started, the time to get an approval is a lot quicker than it was 5 years ago. However, with regard to drug reimbursements of China have been lowered significantly over the last few years. So keep in mind that in China, there's 3 different types of health insurance for the people there. There's the urban employed insurance, there's the urban not employed insurance, and rural insurance. And the NHC, or the National Health Commission, is in charge of pricing and reimbursement. The basic healthcare system is organized by the National Health Security Administration, and the NHSA maintains the basic medical assurance scheme, and along with other government agency, includes drugs on the national reimbursement list. Also, the county, municipal, and provincial counterparts of the NHC or NHSA are key for reimbursement too. It is important to be listed in the provincial NMP bidding and procurement platforms. Prices are determined by safety and efficacy, supply and demand. The Chinese government has been reducing drug prices over the last few years by about 50% via volume-based procurement, DRGs, and DIPs, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. Health economics assessment is becoming more prevalent for drug reimbursement, but the Chinese government is not required to adhere to such data. New low-cost supplemental insurance is now being offered to help pay for expensive drugs, and there is the emergence of commercial insurance for some people in China that can afford it. Next. Now, I don't know if there are many people on the call today that are dealing with generic drugs, but with respect to generic drugs, generic quality consistency evaluation is an important factor. Generic drugs must meet China's generic quality and consistency evaluation. And keep in mind that oftentimes Chinese generics will not meet GQCE until, let's say, the foreign originator drug is entering China market. The GQCE is normally already met by foreign generic drugs. And when generics without GCE compete with originator branded drugs, the originator will do well since the medical institutions in China strongly prefer originator drugs. But keep in mind too, that once a generic drug passes GQCE in China, and then a foreign drug applies in China for the NEMPL, the National Essential Medical List, which we'll talk about next, or the National Reimbursement Drug List, the generic drug that has met GQCE requirements will also automatically be added to those other lists. Because in the lists, it doesn't list the brand names, it just lists the generic name of the drugs. So the general quality consistency evaluation will normally come into effect when a foreign company goes into the market if there's already a generic branded product in the Chinese market. Next slide. Now, the NEML is the National Essential Medical List. Generally, if you're on this list, it increases the size of the China drug market opportunity. Since its inception in 2009, the NEML, the National Essential Medical List, has only been updated twice in 2012 and 2018. The NEML list is a list that is selected and scored by medical experts and announced by the National Health Commission. So whether a drug can be added to the list is based on its efficacy, quality, safety, clinical demand, and supply consistency. Essential drugs are mostly drugs that have been in China for a long time and in high demand. The selected drugs must meet the needs of common diseases with a heavy financial burden and have reasonable cost benefits, and have drugs that have reasonable costs and benefits. So NEML drugs must be priced reasonably. So the reason to be on the NEML list is because the public health institutions in China who dominate the drug purchasing there strongly prefer NEML listed drugs. And as you can see on the third bullet point from the bottom, purchasing NEML, so National Essential Medical List drugs, is one of the performance criteria of how hospitals are rated in China. So that applies to public, primary medical and health institutions, secondary public hospitals, and tertiary public hospitals. And they're required in China, these different institutions, to buy a certain percentage of their drugs off the NEML list. Also, drugs on the NEML list are fully reimbursed because drugs on the NEML list are fully reimbursed on the National Reimbursement Drug List, which we'll talk about next. So if possible, it's important to get onto the NEML list because most of the hospitals are trying to buy their drugs on this. Also, if you're on the NEML list, your product will be automatically reimbursed in the National Reimbursement Drug List. Next. So now we're going to talk about the National Reimbursement Drug List. So the National Reimbursement Drug List is formulated and issued by the National Healthcare Security Administration, or the NHSA. The drugs on the NRDL are reimbursed a certain percentage of drug costs. The NRDL is divided into Class A and Class B drugs. Class A drugs are essential for clinical treatment, and price or treatment cost is lower among similar drugs and fully reimbursed. Class A drugs are often already on the NEML list, National Essential Medical List on the previous slide. So if you're on the NEML list, you're going to be on the Class A drug or the National Reimbursement Drug List. For Class B drugs, a certain percentage of the price is covered by insurance. The remainder is paid out of pocket by the patient. The NRDL, like the NEML, only includes the generic name. It does not include the drug's brand name. So this goes back to the generic drug situation I mentioned. Once a foreign drug is on the NEML or the NRDL, and the Chinese generic product has passed the quality requirements, they will also be automatically added to these lists. Next slide. So again, the NRDL tries to control the drug expenses paid by basic medical insurance. Again, the goal is to reimburse drugs that are essential. The fund wants to make sure that the money is spent wisely, and the NRDL coverage is normally triggered by the market authorization holder. NRDL coverage negotiations in 2022 were postponed. Nevertheless, in 2022, 344 of the 400 drugs that applied for NRDL passed the preliminary NRDL examination, or about 70% of the drugs. Next slide. Now, this gets a little more complicated, but drugs that pass the preliminary NRDL will be classified into two groups by the NHSA: inclusion in the National Reimbursement Drug List via bidding, or inclusion in the National Reimbursement Drug List by negotiation. Now, inclusion in the NRDL via bidding is normally for non-exclusive drugs with a fair price, let's say 70–80% of the price of the medical insurance fund is willing to pay. For example, if the NHSA is willing to pay 100 RMB for a drug, if no bidding is more than 100, this chemical entity will be included in the NRDL. But in case company A bids 80 RMB and case company B bids 50 RMB, the NHSA may only decide to do 70 RMB as the reimbursement drug list for inclusion via bidding. Next, inclusion via negotiation is for exclusive drugs. So pharmacoeconomics experts and fund evaluators determine how much they will pay for exclusive drugs. And they consider the cost utility analysis and cost effective analysis. The NHSA considers the price of alternative drugs and different price metrics in its calculation for inclusion in the National Reimbursed Drug List via negotiation. If the drug is superior to alternative reimbursed prices, the price can be higher than alternative drugs. However, if the originator and the generic drug are both on the NRDL, they will be reimbursed at the same amount. Therefore, oftentimes foreign companies do not want to put their drug on the NRDL because if there's a generic drug approved in China, they will get the same reimbursement as the generic drug. Next. So this slide shows you recent National Reimbursement Drug List price cuts. And it goes through each of the years. In 2016, the first round of negotiations successfully negotiated 3 varieties with an average price cut of 59%. So you can follow the information for the National Reimbursement Drug List price cuts over the last 6 years. Next. Now, separate from the National Essential Medical List and the National Reimbursement Drug List, China is reducing drug prices through other means. The first means is through volume-based procurement. As you can see, the volume-based procurement has dramatically reduced drug prices in China by 50 to 90%. The main principle of VBP is trading off high volumes for winners for lower prices. This is another drug price reduction program and has nothing to do, as I mentioned, with GQCE for generic drugs, the National Essential Medical List, or the National Reimbursement Drug List. Volume-based procurement drugs are selected based on three factors: the clinical need, the enterprise competition, and the financial burden on China's healthcare system. And again, the main purpose is to reduce drug prices in exchange for promised huge volume for companies that win. Volume-based procurement normally starts after the sales of the drug reach 70 million, but the volume-based procurement may start at a lower level in the future. Now, another thing to keep in mind, you have a drug that deals with asthma. Another drug on the market deals with COPD. Let's say your drug for asthma is still selling only a few million a year. So you are not subject to volume-based procurement. But the drug for COPD is selling over 70 million and has been affected by volume-based procurement. Now, the COPD drug also has a secondary use as asthma. So if a competitor in the same therapeutic area experiences price reduction from volume-based procurement, you need to be careful, even if your drug has not had price reduction through volume-based procurement. Next. So again, volume-based procurement is mainly organized at the national level, and provinces can also organize VBP programs according to their own needs. And it gives you some more information on this slide about volume-based procurement. If there are 3 or more participating manufacturing, the bidding method shall be adopted. If there are 2 participating manufacturers, the bargaining method shall be adopted. If there's only 1, the negotiation method shall be adopted. So the volume-based procurement of drugs is determined through volume purchasing and the total annual drug consumption of the public institutions that buy these drugs. However, if 60 to 70% of the drugs are purchased through volume-based procurement, that still leaves 30 to 40% of the demand where public medical institutions can select from provincial VBPs or purchase on their own, and VBP is not a factor. So oftentimes now foreign companies are trying to avoid volume-based procurement by not selling to public medical institutions. Next. So you can look at the second bullet point here. For drugs without competition, unless the price is really high, it is unlikely to be selected for volume-based procurement. Drugs on the NRDL list, on the NRDL and not on the NRDL can be selected for VBP. The Chinese government has had 8 rounds of volume-based procurement price reductions since 2018. And the Chinese government has plans to expand the volume-based procurement price reductions to include as many as 500 molecules that have high-quality GQCE. As I mentioned just before, generally, foreign drug companies prefer to offer higher pricing and cater to the market that is not subject to VBP. Next. So this slide basically just gives you information on 7 of the VBP rounds that occurred. It doesn't have the last round, VBP round 8 on it yet, but this gives you a sense of how many products have experienced volume-based procurement price discounts. Next. So on the second bullet point, as I mentioned, for MNC drug companies, even if they fail to win the VBP bid or decide not to negotiate, they can still enter hospitals and strive for the remaining market share. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Now, in addition to volume-based procurement, another way to reduce drug prices is through designated reimbursement groups. So several years ago, China initiated DRG systems for various diseases. Now there are close to 400 DRGs in China. Keep in mind that within DRG, prices are fixed regardless of the cost and cannot be changed. And since the payments are fixed, new higher priced drugs may not work under China's DRG system. And clinicians may be forced to use only affordable drugs so they meet the DRG requirements. Next. The third way that China now is trying to reduce drug prices is through diagnostic intervention packets, or DIPs. This is still in a pilot stage in 75 cities, but the DIP system uses big data, has over 13,500 DIP groups and many more groups for diseases than the DRG system. The DIP is a case-based payment system under a regional budget, and each DIP group is allocated points, and the value of each point changes depending on the disease and the regional budget. DIP encourages hospitals in the same geographic region to compete with each other with more treatments in a specific disease area, leading to more government funding. So whether you're encountering volume-based procurement, DRGs, or DIPs, diagnostic intervention packets, the Chinese government is reducing the prices of your drugs in China. Next. So as I want to conclude with the following, there's still big opportunities for drug companies in China, for foreign drug companies in China, but you must understand the local dynamics, be very knowledgeable about the registration and reimbursement process. Another trend in China is more Western drug companies are looking to out-license Chinese drugs. Over the last 5 years, more and more Chinese and foreign venture capital money has gone into Chinese drug companies, and these Chinese drug companies are coming out with new compounds and out-licensing many of those drugs to foreign companies. And as I just mentioned, the Chinese domestic drug business is booming with the influx of local and regional venture capital. So still opportunities in China, easier to register, tougher to get good reimbursements. That concludes my formal presentation today, and I'll now be open to questions from the audience.
Thank you, Mr. Gross. It was a very nice presentation. I'm going to go ahead and start reading the questions in the Q&A box. Everyone, if you do have questions, please post them in the Q&A box, and I'll relay them to Mr. Gross here. The first question is, who approves, and this may go back, but who approves the IND?
Well, currently the CDA does not review or approve INDs. Companies agree on assignment by contract. The only thing that needs to be done is to update the sponsor info on the CDE's clinical study registration site. However, draft regulation says in the future, INDs may be approved by the CDE.
Okay. And what are China's laws of drug advertising?
Well, normally the local or provincial NMPAs need to approve all drug advertising in China. including any published media that directly or indirectly introduces the drug. And prescription drugs can not be directly advertised to consumers in China today.
And who tests API DMFs?
Well, to get a DMF for your API in China, you need to submit the dossier, and samples will be tested in China for DMFs for APIs via the National Institute for Food and Drug Control. They will handle the testing and the quality standards. This procedure takes at least 90 working days, and it's best to do this before you submit the drug application.
Okay. And the next question is, for combination products, do the device manufacturing companies need to file a DMF?
I'm sorry, can you say the question again, please?
Sure. For combination products, does the device manufacturing company need to file a DMF?
Well, for combination products, normally the drug would be the dominant side of the product. And so it would be regulated by the drug authorities. And then they would bring in somebody from the Chinese device group to look at the registration requirements for the device. Whether the device in the combination product needs a DMF is up to the device maker. If the device maker thinks that there's confidential manufacturing information in the device drug combination, they may opt to have a DMF. If there's no confidential information in the device and they feel comfortable just sharing the device information with the drug company, then a DMF may not be needed by the device company.
Okay, thank you. What are the approximate government fees for China and a submission for an imported drug?
Well, the approximate government fees for China for the CTA is about $60,000. And I think for the marketing application, it's about $90,000. If you need to submit a supplementary submission without a technical review, I think it's just a couple $1,000s. And if you need to submit a supplementary submission with a technical review, I think it's around $40,000 or $45,000 that need to be paid to the government.
Okay. And here's a good question. How many rare diseases are there in China? And what kind of insurance do Chinese people have?
Well, I mentioned earlier in the presentation, the number of rare diseases in China and orphan drugs is increasing. I think in like 2020, there were 45 drugs approved for orphan drugs. And I think in 2021, there were about 60 orphan drugs approved. And as I mentioned, while more orphan drugs and rare diseases are being acknowledged in China and being registered on using the same documents as a chemical drug registration, the reimbursements for rare diseases or orphan drugs are still quite limited.
Okay, we've got about 3 minutes left. Do not worry. If we don't get to your questions, I'll send them to Ames and he can respond back directly to you. I just want to continue reading the questions. We have the next one is, are there any IP protections for excipient manufacturers required to submit DMFs similar to those for drug companies should their IP be compromised?
Well, for an excipient company to protect their IP, they want to submit a Chinese DMF for an excipient. If they don't submit a Chinese DMF for their excipient, yes, then there could be intellectual property infringement from the final drug manufacturer. That's why companies do DMFs.
Okay. And if the foreign MAH gives its license to another MAH, how is it that the MAH1 is still responsible, a foreign MAH, and has to liaison with the local body? Hopefully you can decipher that question.
So if the drug is made overseas, not in China, then the MAH in China needs to be the MAH in the US or Europe. And then if that company doesn't have a subsidiary operation in China, they need to hire a third party to act as their local agent or local MAH to do the filing of the paperwork with the Chinese government. So I hope that answers the question. I'm not sure it does.
And if everyone goes to the microsite, you'll see that we have Ames's email there, so you can ask him any questions through email. I'm going to ask two more questions. One is from Rui. Does the dossier need to be fully written in Chinese, or is English also accepted?
No, the dossier has to be fully written in Chinese.
And is in-country testing required for an approved drug product?
Yes, in-country testing is required for an approved drug product. Yes.
Okay, I'm going to push the time limit here if you don't mind. If I have conducted bioequivalency study against US innovator, can I apply for ANDA in CDE?
Well, of course, you can use an abridged submission for a generic product in China, but keep in mind you may need to do a BE study to get the approval in China, and of course, Chinese ethnic differences must be considered.
Okay, and the last question. If bioequivalency study is done in an India lab, conducting BE in China population is not required, correct?
No, if a BE study is conducted in an Indian lab, that's not going to suffice in China because you need Chinese patients for the BE study. So again, ethnic considerations are key for registration in China.
And I have one last question that just popped up here, so they're being brave by posting it the very last minute. Regarding IP for excipient manufacturer DMFs, the question was whether there were similar mechanisms to sue as for drug product if they feel their IP has been compromised. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, so we talked about drug patent law for patent infringement for drugs, and this question is asking about patent infringement for excipients. Now, if you submit a DMF for an excipient, it goes directly to the NMPA or CDE, and there should not be any intellectual property stolen. Whether you can determine if another company has stolen your intellectual property or not, I guess would be the issue. And I guess if the excipient IP information is stolen somehow, which I think would be hard to do, but if it is stolen, I believe you could issue a lawsuit, but I'd have to look into that more carefully. I'm not 100% sure on that, but I would assume you could. But keep in mind, when you're initiating lawsuits in China as a foreign company, it's generally hard to win. So after you pay $100,000, $200,000, $300,000 for the lawyer, and your chance of success is maybe 30%, is it worth doing a lawsuit? I guess that becomes the question.
Okay. And at this time, this concludes the workshop. Any last remarks, closing remarks, Ames?
Thank you, Robin. I appreciate the consideration from RAPS, and thank you to the audience for attending. I hope the webcast today was informative, provided some new information for you, and will help you with your registration and reimbursement issues in China. Thank you again.